because everything we're doing, from population to consumption, however you measure it, is growing exponentially. And to put it in a more crass way, we're virtually eating and consuming ourselves out of house and home, namely the home planet. And it's going to take some rethinking of all this very, very quickly to keep ourselves from getting in very, very deep trouble. And we're already approaching that point. We've already reaching peak oil in consumption of fossil fuels or oil fuels. And we've got to find something else. And what's been one of my major interests is how do we find and utilize the basic energy of the universe, which is called the zero-point energy field, from which matter is made, all matter is made. And that maybe can help us get past this great hurdle that we're facing right now. And
isn't it ironic, too, as a species, you would think that our overriding instinct would be our survival instinct, and that in this period of transformation and really urgency, as you've described, that you know, even greed would be overridden by the absolute obviousness of the times we're in, that we have to completely redefine how we live. You know, what we look at as success, how we see ourselves as separate instead of interconnected. You would think that something about the times we're in would you know, sound alarm bells, yet it seems we need absolute crisis before we'll be willing to sort of adopt the obvious in this case.
I think you're absolutely right. We do need to see more crisis. And most people are just not interested in converting and confronting the fact that a paradigm change or a change in thinking is really vital at this point in time, and that we're rapidly approaching what's called a bifurcation point. We'll either start to solve the problem and get better rapidly, or we're going to not solve the problem and get worse rapidly. And that's what we're facing over the next decade or so.
Ultimately up to us. A great segue. We're going to take a break and back more with Dr. Mitchell, and not only on expanding on what we're talking about also, but some other things that seemingly you know, we're at a crossroads about, and it's going to be up to us whether we, you know, open our minds or continue to repress some things that seem pretty obvious, and that's the fact that we're not alone in this universe. After the break, more with Dr. Edgar Mitchell.
What's been the LR cube? Yes? Okay? And not now.
I fully believe that we're not alone, and have for many, many years, even though, but at the time I went to the moon, it was the conventional wisdom, both in science and theology, that we were alone in the universe. We're just barely out of the trees, even though we think we're rather sophisticated. But I do like to tell the story that my great-grandparents came across from southern United States to the west after our Civil War. And I went to the moon less than 100 years later. They came across in covered wagons. So from covered wagons to going to the moon in less than 100 years in our lifetime is a rather significant event. It tells us how primitive we have been until the modern era, and we're still rather primitive. Because of my openness to these things, I did have many of the old-timers in the military and in the intelligence community over the years wanting to get it off their chest before they passed away, allowed me to interview them and talk to them about it. And so my ideas became fairly well solidified in the fact we've been visited.
Welcome back to the One Network with Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, the man that spent the most time on another planet, 9 hours actually on the lunar surface, and unbelievably has actually perhaps exceeded that incredible accomplishment by the next 40 years of his life. A real pioneer, a real explorer, which is, you know, the spirit of that is what allowed him to, you know, take that incredible mission, that incredible leap on behalf of humanity. But arguably his contributions to humanity and its existence have excelled and been enhanced since he's returned to Earth. Dr. Mitchell, we were talking before the break about resistance to change, let's say, and in the scientific community, ironically, which used to be at loggerheads or still is at loggerheads, essentially with the religious or spiritual community, it can be more dogmatic at times than religion itself, with a real resistance to taking a different perspective. Now, that couldn't be more true than around the subject matter that's highly controversial, which seems incredible to me in the year 2011, about the fact of whether we here on Earth are alone in the universe. And if we were just to take a mathematical perspective, again, with you, a man of science, is it not already at the beginning of the conversation essentially mathematically impossible that we would be alone in this galaxy, let alone in the universe?
Well, to me it is. Now that we're starting to have the tools in astronomy and with the Hubble telescope, there's nothing we have to do.
You're breaking up a little. I'm not sure if there's a problem with your microphone. Oh, that's better.
That's better? Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I moved my head a lot. Anyhow, the whole point is that we are facing these problems. They're problems of the 20th century of too rapid a growth. But as we're getting a new insight into the size of the universe, looking deeper and deeper into the universe, seeing more and more galaxies and galactic clusters, and billions of them, we realize just how humongous our universe is. And it seemingly is without end. And we did not know that 50 years ago or 60 years ago at really the beginning of the space age. And as we see that, and we see the billions and billions of galaxies and galactic clusters available, it's inconceivable to think anymore that we're alone in the universe. And then, of course, we have had those instances, and I don't consider myself really an expert in this area, although I've been associated with it and although I have been exposed to a lot of it, that we have been visited by alien visitors, and perhaps over a long, long period of time.
One of the things that when this subject comes up, and if I'm talking, about this with friends who, again, this can be a difficult thing to wrap your head around. But one of the things that made it even more difficult, I think, was, our sort of extreme treatment of the idea of alien, and forgetting that, instead of, creatures and, green men from Mars and all that stuff that was kind of made more prominent in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and some of the the creature features, that if you dialed this back to the times of even the the 1500s, the 1400s, when we were essentially going outside of what we considered to be the beginning and the end of our universe almost, which was whether it be Europe or otherwise, and when we would come across other cultures, whether it be in Africa or Australia or in North America, there would be this obvious realization that, wow, we're not alone, quote unquote, like we thought on the Earth, and these aliens, as we referred to other human beings before, are very much like us, perhaps different colored skin, but for the most part, anthropomorphized beings. And maybe if we were able to apply that same thing to the idea of other planets, instead of thinking it's big insects or crazy transformer-like beings, that if you allow yourself that the border of an ocean, that separated two cultures, was simply that, then maybe the idea of an ocean of space separating two types of cultures, perhaps what we're looking for out there is very much like us, with very few sort of differences.
Well, that certainly seems to be the case. There may be, I'm sure there are some differences, but I'm also sure there's some certain similarities. And from the research I'm aware of, that going back 400 years or so, just like you were referring to, that there has likely been evidence of that knowledge, even in the primitive cultures. For example, in some of Michelangelo's paintings, there are pictures of a UFO in the landscape. Mm-hmm. And there are other evidences of it throughout most of our history. Now, I don't consider myself really a top-notch expert in that area, but I am quite familiar with all the literature, some of the good, some of the bad, and many of the individuals who have spent decades here working the problem. So I don't have any doubt but what we have intelligent beings visiting us, and it looks like they're doing their best to stay out of our way, be somewhat friendly, encourage us to come along and develop ourselves, and maybe even being cooperative. Now, there were some of the researchers say that there are certain of them that are not nearly that cooperative and are more difficult to get along with. I haven't had that experience myself, so I can't really speak to it.
And not necessarily, again, if you apply that same sort of prism that how we would look at people, of course there would be, you know, there were explorers that were going around the world and coming to different cultures that were, you know, quote unquote good, and there's quote unquote bad. And, you know, again, if we can get outside of that idea of separation and kind of look at it through the human prism, these things aren't necessarily, you know, all that unbelievable. And the stuff that you're talking about, and it's not just some evidence of visitation in the ancient times, but when you have not just one, but multiple petroglyphs around the world, whether it be the Australian Aboriginals, whether it be the Mayans, whether it be the Nazca lines in South America, whether it be in China, there is no part of this planet that does not have drawings on cave walls of beings that are clearly, you know, in spaceships and or looking, you know, humanoid beyond what was, you know, around at the time. And it's almost, from an anthropological perspective, it almost is impossible to look past that evidence. Yet, you know, still to this day, you have people sort of, you know, well, this was fantasy, this was folklore, but it seems that there's an abundant, overwhelming amount of evidence that, you know, a few thousand years ago, this was almost prominent, that there was visitation from outside of this planet to the ancient civilizations.
I totally agree with you. I mean, there is all that sort of evidence in the ancient cultures in several ways, if we choose to look at it very deeply, have had these type of experiences for quite a long time. Yes, absolutely right.
You mentioned earlier too, and let's say we were going to look at this from an outsider's perspective and use a term that would be familiar to Star Trek fans as the prime directive. And it seems that, you know, if you were to say that, because sometimes the argument is, well, if there's people visiting us, why wouldn't they land on the White House lawn and expose themselves? And I think, you know, personally, I find that a naive or ignorant perspective. But I think that, again, there's a lot of examples in sci-fi, I find, that almost seem like they were taken out of the pages of classified documents. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk that whether it be your George Lucas's or your Gene Roddenberry's or your Stanley Kubrick's, that a lot of some of the, you know, of their work has been pretty incredibly accurate around what would be at least theoretical in this space. You know, from your times inside the establishment, that there was, you know, this was obviously pretty hush-hush, but it wasn't a secret necessarily that you know, that there was knowledge of this. Do you believe that certain people, whether it be military, whether it be government, and, you know, even to the point of some, you know, Hollywood, you know, types, that there is, you know, a certain, you know, establishment that does understand and know and is, you know, obviously not disclosing it, but is benefiting perhaps from it?
Yes, that's certainly true. And let me point out to you from what you said earlier, that there was a great flyover incident, you said around the White House lawn, over Washington, D.C.
The Capitol building, yeah.
A large number in about 1952 or 3, as I recall. And that was kind of whitewashed over, okay, mentioned one day, gone the next. And then, of course, our Phoenix Lights event here in the city of Phoenix, Arizona, about 1997, I believe it was.
Seen by, I think, governors, senators, yes, not just
a lot of people,
policemen, you name it, across the board. The actual governor of Arizona admitted to seeing that as well. This was not just, you know, the old weather balloon thing. This was seen by hundreds of people.